All right, good seeing everybody for class this morning. If you have not been to the back table yet to get notes, there are 3 pages back there. One is today's notes that we've had available for the last week or so. The other 2 are the remainder of the notes for the book of Ezra. So there'll be chapter 10, and there's 2 separate pages for chapter 10, lesson number 12 and lesson number 13. They're on the back table, and so just go ahead and take a look at those, and we will be in chapter 10, the first part of it, next week, and then the following week, the very last lesson in the book of Ezra. Today, we are in chapter 9, so let's be turning our Bibles to Ezra chapter 9. Ezra chapter 9. And we are going to attempt to do lesson number 11 on chapter 9 in one session. I think we can. We just basically have 2 questions. And one is very specific about the first 2 verses, and the other is just sort of a walkthrough of the remainder of the verses. And there's nothing, incredibly hard to understand about the rest of the verses. But just a heads up, we will be talking about chapter 10 beginning next week, and the 2 note pages for this are on the back table. So if you look at it and you see the one, you think this is all I need, you might as well go ahead and grab the last one too and just add it to your notes so we can be completely done with the notes for Ezra, and then afterward we'll move on to something else. By the way, if you have a suggestion as to where to go next in the New Testament, let us know. We love going Old Testament, New Testament, back and forth. So if you have a recommendation for a book to study in the New Testament, I'm all ears. So please let me know. I think most everyone here, at least the largest percentage of us, were involved last night in the efforts of the fall block party. The real purpose of that is to connect with people from the community. We had well over 4,000, we're estimating now, probably. My count was 4,300 and something, but we always have a bunch to come in through the back that I don't get to. So if you add those, 50 or 60 people, maybe upward of 100 people, we probably had over 4,400 people come through last night. We were well over our number from last year. Now, last year was a great year. We had 3,200 and something last year. This year was almost double, or 1,000 more than that. And we gave away like 80 of the Bibles. We had 80 Bibles given away, and we had 6 people sign up for Bible studies, which is amazing. That's worth it all to get 6 Bible studies out of that. And we're going to be following up this afternoon with those 6 and see where they want to go with their Bible studies. But it's just amazing, really, really amazing. Appreciate all the effort, especially, we all ought to be thanking Josh, because Josh is the one who really sort of is at the core of all that. And he deserves the credit for that because he really does a great job getting it together. All right, Ezra chapter 9. Ezra chapter 9. On this first one, we're going to read the question, read the 2 verses, and then we'll go into some discussion. All right, what problem is immediately identified with the people in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2? Go back and study also Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 through 6. What was God's condition for the people of Israel regarding marriage? Why did He impose this? And are there historical evidences of the truth of God's warning in the history of the Bible? Name some examples if you can think of some. Is there anything as a mixed marriage today under the new covenant? Explain your answer. And what is the lesson for today, especially for those considering marriage? Now let's look at these 2 verses, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. When these things were done, the leaders came to me saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with respect to the abominations of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy seed is mixed with the peoples of those lands. Indeed, the hand of the leaders and rulers has been foremost in this trespass. What's going on? You've got God's people, and they were intermarrying with pagans. That's what was happening in this passage. It was against God's will. And that's one reason why we had a reference back to Deuteronomy 7. In fact, if you went back and read that passage, and you read Ezra chapter 9, especially verse 1, it sounds like a near restatement of the same thing. There's a problem here. So what's so bad about that? What's the problem with that?
They're going to lead the Jews away.
Lead them away, Joel?
Well, it's like the thing from Deuteronomy. How the nation, I will also do like you shall not worship the Lord your God.
Mm-hmm.
And they were taking worship of Baal, all this, and they were doing that.
Yeah.
Operating into that.
There was a stipulation. We're going to read that stipulation in just a moment. Let's take a look, first of all. Go to verse 2. Obviously, they're intermingled with the peoples, which was bad enough, but the cultural influence on them was just terrible. Look at Ezra chapter 9. Look at verse 2. And listen to this. Let's talk about this part of this verse, first of all. They'd taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that now this is the part that I think is very important, so that the holy seed is mixed with the peoples of the lands. There is a ultimate, far-reaching, overarching principle embedded in this. And what do you see in this when he says the holy seed is being mixed? The seed line promise. When did the seed line promise start in the Bible? Genesis 3, verse 15 is the first glimpse of it. And then the first person is Abraham, right? So you go back to Genesis 3:15, and when he's speaking to Satan, he says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. It shall bruise your head, right? It's going to conquer you by crushing you, and you shall bruise its heel. That's the first glimpse we get in the Bible of the seed promise, which is Jesus. Now, the first person we get that through is Abraham, because in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3-ish, right in there, Abraham has promised that through him, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And the blessing there would be spiritual blessings through Christ. You get up to chapter 22, he's got his son Isaac on one of the altars. You know, he's built on the mountain, takes him down, puts the ram that's caught in the thicket instead. And God says to him, he is going to be the one in whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed. The seed will come through him. You go forward a little bit, it goes through Jacob. You move forward a little bit to Genesis 49:10, and you've got the scepter not departing from Judah. So it gets narrowed all the way through the book of Genesis. We've never forgotten the seed promise. He has not forgotten it now. Now, why would it be so important to the seed promise for them not to intermarry with pagan peoples? What is God doing to bring Christ into the world through that? What happens if the tribes of Israel dissolve and are no more? There's no longer a Judah from which he could come. So the marriage stipulation was in part to preserve the tribes as they existed, because Jesus would come from Judah, and it would be about preserving that, also preserving the land in which they lived in order for Jesus to be able to come into the world. So that's one thing to consider. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that every single person in the seed line was flawless, because did God sometimes use bad people in the seed line to accomplish his purposes? Yes. You even have the mention of, Rahab is involved in it. But Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17, you read that, and there's some good folks in there, and some had mistakes in their life, and some had sins. That reminds us of Romans 8, verse 28 and following, when Paul says God is able to make all things work together for good to those that love the Lord. That's about his ability to accomplish his will in spite of the faults of men. When it comes to the grand scheme of redemption, God was always going to get his will done. He was going to accomplish it no matter what. But one of the stipulations would be they were not allowed to intermarry, because he was preserving the nation as it existed, because Christ was coming into the world through them. Now, we say this because the New Testament is going to build only on the principle of that, but it does not really bind the precept of that. We're going to talk about that more in just a little bit. Joel mentioned Deuteronomy 7. We're going to go to that in just a second. Well, in fact, let's go there now. Here's the original order. It looks a lot like what we just read in Ezra chapter 9. Let's go to Deuteronomy 7. We'll go ahead and look at that now. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7. We're going to read the first 11 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 7. All right, when the Lord God brings you into the land which you go to possess and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. When you read that verse, does that sound a lot like Ezra chapter 9, verse 1? It's almost repeating some of the same nations. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. Now, stop there. What did that involve? What was God's order for the land of Canaan? Completely drive them out. Don't leave any left in there. God knew in advance the danger that people left in the land would pose to them. Well, then he puts a stipulation on the relationship that they would have with those peoples. Verse 3 says, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son and take their daughter for your son. Now, when you read Ezra chapter 9, verse 2, and he's explaining the problem, that's exactly what they had done. Because he says they've taken daughters and put them with their sons, and they've given their sons to their daughters. They've intermarried with these folks. And there's a reason for this. Look at verse 4. For they would turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the people on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you nor choose you because you are more in number than any other people, for you are least of all peoples, but because the Lord loves you and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers. The Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Therefore know that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments, and repays those who hate him to their face to destroy them. He will not be slack with him who hates him. He will repay him to his face. Therefore you shall keep the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments which I command you today to observe them. Reading that, there's more than one reason why God wanted them not to marry the pagans. One would be to preserve the nation as it was, to keep the tribes intact because God would send his son through Judah. That's one reason. What was the other? Intermarriage with somebody that did not share the same worldview would corrupt their worldview and turn them away from God. So he tells them, don't make marriages, because they're going to turn away your hearts from the Lord. They're going to lead you to idolatry. By the way, did that happen? Yeah, that's it's almost prophetic, but it's certainly predictive here when God is saying this would be the ultimate consequence of that. This was not just simply an issue of seed line, but a restriction meant to protect them spiritually. God had their best interest in mind in doing this. And in his wisdom, God knew where people would end up at if they chose to dishonor and neglect that restriction. And it happened exactly as he said. Can you think of any examples in the Old Testament where you see that play out? Who? Oh, Solomon is one. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 11. Look at 1 Kings chapter 11. Solomon had two problems. Not only did he have too many women, he had the wrong kind of women. But look at chapter 11, 1 Kings chapter 11. Verse 1, but King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of, now listen to this, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. Does that list sound a lot like Deuteronomy 7? Yeah, so he's doing the very opposite of what God said. From the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after other gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For so it was when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their God. So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. It's exactly playing out as God said that it would play out. And why is that? It would seem maybe to some so insignificant that a spouse could make such a difference. But why is it such a big deal? What do you think?
If I start hanging out with people who like gambling, I'm going to feel a little taxed. I'm going to start feeling like, well, that's okay. That's not a big problem. And next thing you know, I may be head over heels in debt because I've been gambling.
Right? The associations have a lot, Andy.
It's slowly you accept something. It could be small. You're just hanging out with them. You're like, well, that's okay. But over time,
Yes.
you're going to start accepting more and more.
Yeah. Does it matter the people that we put ourselves around? Of course it does. Joel, I saw your hand.
Well, of course, I've got to think about Ruth and Boaz, you know.
Mm.
Ruth was she was not a Jew.
Right.
You know? Obviously, that was blessed as they became great grandparents to King David.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I don't see this. She had probably already proven herself
Mm-hmm.
who she was and what she was.
Yeah.
But yet she was Moabite.
Yeah.
And yet God not only allowed it, but produced it.
Yeah. He was able to take twists and turns in it and make something out of it. Kevin?
Holiness is something we have trouble with.
Yeah, that's right.
Because just a little leaven.
That's it. That's the principle, and it's been stated. Art and Andy and you have all said that same thing. Who has the single most influence over you physically in this life? Your spouse does. There's no question a spouse has the most influence over what you'll believe, over what you'll do, what you'll become or not become. Your spouse has the most influence over that in life. And if people say that's not true, you've got a history that says that's not true. You go back to Genesis 3, and who partook of the forbidden fruit first? Eve did, and when she gave it to Adam, what did Adam do? Sure, I'll have some too. And he ate, very influential. Nobody forgets the story of Samson and Delilah. He should never have married that woman. She's one of the people that he was not supposed to marry. But she was wicked. I mean, she was of the Philistines, and, he might have resisted for a little bit, but when eventually she said, you don't really love me if you don't tell me your secret. And he goes, well, it's all about the hair. So he gave in because of the influence of that. Super huge influence, spouses are. Jezebel was terrible. Yeah. There may have even been a chance for Ahab had it not been for Jezebel. When John the Baptist was killed, you've got Herod, and when Herodias, who he shouldn't have been married to in the first place, said, let me have my daughter dance in front of you, and you're going to give us whatever we want. We'll take John the Baptist's head on a platter. That's what he gave them. In Acts 5, when Ananias and Sapphira plot together, there's spousal influence as to what they're going to do. In a positive sense, you see the same thing when you've got like Aquila and Priscilla. It's the single strongest influence we have in this life. God knows that, and if it's the wrong kind of influence, it can be devastating. Don?
I think one of the things I always think about these lives is the statement made in Mark, house divided.
Cannot stand? Mm-hmm.
The same thing, if you're married to a non-Christian, it's harder for you to live Christian life.
Sure.
So eventually, your house is going to go one way or the other.
Right. It will. It will. Now, here's the question. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Well, I just wondered, is this not the same principle Paul was speaking of, Ephesians 5, verse 11?
No fellowship for works. In principle, yeah, the principle is true. So let's talk about the New Testament real quick, because reading Ezra 9, somebody will ask, but is it exactly the same in the New Testament? So the question is, does the New Testament strictly forbid these types of arrangements? It doesn't. As a matter of fact, are there some scriptures that show the possibility of a Christian being married to a non-Christian? Yes, it shows that in the New Testament. Oops, sorry. Joel? Yes, that's one of them. Okay, 1 Peter 3 is one of those where it says if you have a woman and she's married to an unbeliever, she can still, through her lifestyle, convert the unbeliever by just remaining holy, as he sees that. Another would be 1 Corinthians 7 when he talks about a believer and an unbeliever being joined together. So in the New Testament, that prohibition doesn't exist like it did in the Old Testament, where there's a strict prohibition against that. Kevin?
Kind of the same concept that we talked about before, where things that were physical in nature in the Old Testament now become spiritual in nature under the New Covenant. That movement from the physical, the tabernacle, the temple,
Right.
now, right here.
Right.
The same kind of thing here. What was physical is now spiritual.
Yeah, and there are some passages that get abused, I think, to try to show that the restriction is exactly the same. One is 2 Corinthians chapter 6:14 when it says, what fellowship does a believer have with an unbeliever? What righteousness does unrighteousness have? Now, to Steve's point, the principle is there, which I think helps guide us, but some try to take and apply that to marriage specifically, and that's not really a marriage passage. The other would be 1 Corinthians 7:39, where it says that if a woman loses a husband, she's at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. And some have tried to make that she can only marry a Christian. And that's not what that means there. It's an adverbial phrase that means she has to marry in harmony with the Lord's will. She must marry an eligible person when she does that. There's nothing in the New Testament like Deuteronomy 7 or Ezra chapter 9 and 10, because Ezra 9 and 10 is big on the commandment to not marry outside the faith. But is there principle that should help us make a decision on whom we marry? And there's a difference there, right? So what advice should we give based on the Old Testament regulation and the New Testament principle? What advice should we give on this? Well, here's a couple of things to consider. Number one, your choice of a spouse, the choice a person makes in a spouse, will be the single greatest influence on your life. So the question is, what kind of influence do you want on your life? Do you want to go to heaven? Because it's going to affect whether that remains your top priority or not. And I always think of this, number two, what effect will this have on the children, right? Because if you've got somebody who is, and it doesn't make them unkind or mean, it just means if they have different religious values and you're trying to train your children to love the truth and go to heaven, and you've got dual religion happening in your family, what's the effect on children? Confusion. They don't understand truth. And if the goal is to get kids to heaven, then marry inside of the truth. And this would get me. If your spouse never becomes a Christian, you can't be, for men, you can't be the most that you can be in the church. As young men, what should young men aspire hopefully to be in the church one day? Elders and deacons. And without a faithful wife, you can't be. According to 1 Timothy 3, you can't be. And here's the thing, too. Statistically, it is a very large number. I mean, it's high. Statistically, a very large percentage of people who marry outside the faith, guess what they do with the faith later in life? They leave it. It's just statistically true. They're willing to risk faithfulness for their marriage. My advice always is to people, because sometimes people get desperate and they'll say, I feel like I'm never going to get married. If you're patient and you trust in the Lord, God will provide. He will provide a spouse. If you're really wanting to be married and you want that, there are plenty of people out there that are faithful people who can help you get to heaven. They're out there, and God will help you find that. I'm just convinced of that. I really believe that. All right, so that's Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. It's a huge problem. Now, this problem is going to be addressed in chapter 9 and in chapter 10, because the problem in chapter 10 is, now that you've got these women or these men, what are you supposed to do with them? And there's going to be a separation of those because they're not allowed to have that. That's all the discussion in chapter 10. And so let's look at the rest of chapter 9 now. Number 2 in our questions, Why was Ezra so upset about the condition of the people in verses 13, or really in verses 3 through verse 15? What does this say about marriage? What do we often discount about the seriousness of marriage and explain that? How should we view marriage, especially as Christians? And why do you think the church often turns a blind eye to marriage in general and marriages specifically in the church? So let's look at verse 3 through 15, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. Verse 3. So here's Ezra now. So when I heard this thing, I tore my garment and my robe. I plucked out some of the hair of my head and beard and sat down astonished. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel assembled to me because of the transgression of those who had been carried away captive, and I sat astonished until the evening sacrifice. At the evening sacrifice, I arose from my fasting, and having torn my garment and my robe, I fell on my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord my God. And I said, "Oh my God, I am too ashamed and humiliated to lift up my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has grown up to the heavens. Since the days of our fathers to this day, we have been very guilty. And from our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been delivered into the hand of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plunder, and to humiliation, as it is this day. And now for a little while, grace has been shown from the Lord our God to leave us a remnant to escape and to give us a peg in His holy place, that our God may enlighten our eyes and give us a measure of revival in our bondage. For we were slaves. Yet our God did not forsake us in our bondage, but He extended mercy to us in the sight of the kings of Persia to revive us, to repair the house of our God, to rebuild its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. And now, O our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants, the prophets, saying, the land which you are entering to possess is an unclean land, with the uncleanness of the peoples of the lands, with their abominations, which have filled it from one end to another with their impurity. Now therefore do not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your children forever. And after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, since you our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserve, and have given us such deliverance as this, should we again break your commandments and join in marriage with the people committing these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you had consumed us, so that there would be no remnant or survivor? O Lord our God, you are righteous, for we are left as a remnant, as it is this day. Here we are before you in our guilt, that no one can stand before you because of this." What a very impassioned prayer to God, communication with God. What's going on here? What is he saying? There's a lot wrapped up in that, I think. Yeah, humility. And he goes back in history, right? And he says, there was a time when we were captives and you delivered us. And what did they do to that opportunity originally? They wasted it. And he says, and then after all of that we didn't deserve, you delivered us from that. And now what's his concern? We're wasting it again. We're wasting that opportunity again. He's begging for God's mercy and for forgiveness for the people and for guidance on what to do. So you saw in verse 3, he tears his garments and he tears his robe. You sometimes see that in Bible. And what is that a demonstration of? Yeah, deep grief and repentance, immense sorrow on the part of the person. Now, he's the only one I know he's the only one I know who does this to himself. When we look at this next week and the week next, Nehemiah does this, but he does it to other people. He does it to people that are married in bad marriage. He just tears their hair out. That's what he does. He's like, "What were you thinking?" and starts, pulling their hair out. Ezra is doing this to himself. He's pulling and he's pulling hairs out of his head. I think it's an indication of such deep grief. He is so afflicted by what the people have done. There's personal affliction here. And he sat down astonished. He sat down literally desolate. He's just in silence, and he's alone, and he's horror-stricken. That's how much he was affected by this. He's devastated. You get that from reading these verses. And so in verse 4, the ones that, there were some that actually cared, that came and rallied around Ezra. They sit around him in verse 4, and he sits until the time of the evening sacrifice, and then he gets up and gets on his knees, which I think Kevin's right. It is a sign of humility. You see a lot of humility on Ezra's part here. In verse 6, Ezra was too ashamed even to lift his head. You know, sometimes we're prideful. We don't realize how prideful we are. He's divested himself of all of himself. There's nothing left in him. He's so sad to have come so far in history only to fall back into the sins that led to their captivity in the first place. And you see that in verses 7 to 10. He's talking about how they fell back into sin, and how in verses 11 through 15 God is righteous and has acted righteously, but the people have not done righteously. And the law was very clear. Ezra knew that they were wrong because the law was clear. Don't marry these people. What is all of this a reminder of in relation to marriage? Is it a serious arrangement? Should it be taken seriously? Yeah. And I don't know that sometimes we view it as such. I always remember the statement in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, when it says, marriage is honorable and all, and the bed undefiled. The bed there would be the sexual aspect of the right marriage. But then he says, but adulterers and fornicators, God will judge. Serious thing with lots of consequences to it. In fact, in Galatians 5, when he's talking about the works of the flesh, he says the works of the flesh are these. He starts with adultery and then moves to fornication and then lists 2 other sexual sins right behind that. And when you get to the end of that list, he says, and such like. And he says those who do that will not inherit the kingdom of God. So it's a serious thing. It's so serious that if you get it wrong, it'll keep you out of heaven. That's how serious marriage is. So serious that when Jesus talked about it in Matthew 19, that when Jesus was done talking, the disciples said, if that's true, who can be married? It'd be better to be a eunuch, wouldn't it? Who can be married with such stringent things? It's supposed to be stringent. It's supposed to be strict. It doesn't mean miserable and stiff. It just means that there are standards to marriage, and they're supposed to be respected, but it's a serious thing. Any thoughts on that before we get to this next one? Yeah, Tommy?
Well, we go back to the beginning with Adam and Eve, and we look at the establishment of the family, and the family is basically
It's the first institution that God ever put on earth. Yeah.
because
Everything else surrounds it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so here's my question. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was just going to say, we're toward the end of the book, where he talks about how long will you bear with us. I'm reminded of Malachi,
Yeah,
when he says, I am God, I change not.
Yeah.
We say that a lot, but we forget the next phrase, which is, therefore you sons of Jacob are not consumed.
yep, yeah. Obviously, we're different. Our level of patience is different than God's, and the principle there about God not changing is His view has never changed of marriage. So that's a good point to make there. If what happened in Ezra's day happened today, and it does happen today, in the principle of chapter 10, we'll talk about bad marriages, what bad marriages truly are today. If that comes into a congregation, do you think most congregations today would be so deeply grieved that would be on our knees begging God for mercy and forgiveness? Or would most people say, great, come on in? Yeah. Should we not see it like Ezra saw it? That when there's corruption or when there's something that is in violation of the will of God, should we be so afflicted by that we beg God for time to fix it? But I don't think that's what's happening. So why isn't that the case? Why do we sometimes just observe the Passover, so to speak, on marriages when we know that they're not in harmony with the Lord's will? Why is it that we just say, well, that's fine. You keep on making contribution and you keep on doing some stuff, we're fine. Why do we do that? Nobody likes conflict. I mean, nobody likes that. It is stomach-wrenching to have to tell someone, hey, according to this, it's not right. And it's a terrible thing. Next week and the week after, we're going to get into one of the things when, if somebody is unscripturally married, sometimes kids are involved. And in chapter 10, kids are involved because they're mentioned twice in the chapter. Some of them had children. But there's still an expectation of something in that chapter. So confrontation is a terrible thing. Nobody likes it. And the easier route is to just do nothing about it. Any other reason? What do you think, Tommy?
Well, and a lot of people kind of feel, well, God's just going to excuse it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want any disharmony or anything like that. And God,
That is believed.
yeah, I had a discussion
Yeah. I know of a congregation where it was found in that. I'll tell you what happens usually. If a congregation doesn't take any stand on marriage, what happens is it becomes the collecting point for everybody with unscriptural marriages. They find solace in that place. And it was discovered at some point that there were a lot of marriages that were unscriptural. And somebody said something to the elders about it and said, hey, this is a problem. And the elder said, we can't say anything about it or we'll lose all the members. It was all about money and numbers, not about souls. It's a sad thing. That's why these two chapters are so important, because there's some principle there about how serious marriage is. Yes, sir?
But it's not only that, it's family members.
Yes.
Church,
Yeah.
I can't lose the whole family.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes it's deeply connected like that. That's going to become part of our talking points in the next 2 weeks, because Ezra and Nehemiah, they're colliding on this. They're right at the same time, and Nehemiah, he grabs the people and he's ripping their hair out and saying, you can't have these spouses. But he knows what the consequence is if they keep them. They're going to be lost if they kept them, and he's not willing to let them do that. That was in spite of family connections and children. It's just a terrible thing. Yeah, Ash?
Well, and part of the problem, the main problem too is they didn't even try to convert these spouses.
That's right.
You know,
Yeah.
that's the main, like
Yeah.
Joel brought up Ruth and Boaz. Ruth, when she left with Naomi, she says in her speech, your Lord is, your
Yeah,
God is my
she became a
God,
convert.
your life is
Yeah,
my life.
yeah.
I forsake all else for you and your religion. You know, she gave herself to God.
Yeah, and
I think that's a big difference.
oh yeah, that is.
Even
And
Rahab, you brought up Rahab.
Rahab, yeah.
She saved the spies.
Yes, she did.
She did what was right.
And she's
God rewarded
James 2, she's listed in James 2 as having now had that kind of faith. One of the problems here is, according to Malachi, you mentioned Malachi mentions in the same context, they had actually put away their Hebrew wives to marry the pagan wives. So they had been married and broke a covenant to marry these pagan women, and now you've got a twisted, bad problem. But until this point, nobody was willing to do something about it.
Another side point that's not really mentioned here is in verse 2, it says, the hand of the princes and rulers have been chief in the trespass.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't just,
No, it wasn't just the average
no,
ordinary member of Israel. It was the leaders who were involved in it. But I think going through chapter 9, the lesson is marriage is super serious, and if it's wrong, it has to be corrected. It's got to be corrected. It can't be left undone. Ezra shows by his grief that it wasn't something that he could just turn a blind eye to and leave it alone. He knew that people were in trouble spiritually, and it had to be fixed. As for other reasons, I don't know, maybe sometimes there's a lack of conviction or we're unconvinced of what the truth of something is. But I think what Gloria said, sometimes we just are afraid of confrontation. We're afraid we're going to hurt somebody's feelings. And it's not like we're trying to hurt feelings, but if something is not right scripturally, you've got to help people try to get to heaven. That's the goal, is to help people to get to heaven. Yes, Alexandria?
I think, too, a lot of the reason could be that it's so deeply ingrained in your life that if you have a gambling problem, you can stop gambling. But if you have a marriage problem, your life.
It's connected to everything. Everything is connected to it. Yeah, and so I hope what you'll do is take a look at chapter 10, because that's chapter 10. He's not unaware of how deeply connected everything is, but he knows there's only one solution to it. And so we're going to cover it in 2 lessons. So you've got lesson 12 and lesson 13 are all on chapter 10. And we'll be in lesson number 12 next week. Thank you guys, appreciate it. And I hope this chapter is challenging to us. Thank you, appreciate it.